The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Maryland like a funeral shroud, obscuring the movements of nearly 100,000 men, who would soon transform the quiet countryside into America's bloodiest battlefield. It was September 17, 1862, and the fate of a divided nation hung in the balance as the massive armies prepared to collide. Near the sleepy town of Sharpsburg, General Robert Edward Lee, the Confederate commander whose tactical brilliance had already earned him legendary status, gazed across the Antietam Creek with the weary eyes of a man carrying the weight of Southern independence on his shoulders. His army of Northern Virginia, though battle-hardened and fiercely loyal, numbered barely 55,000 men, many of them barefoot, hungry, and exhausted from their grueling march into Maryland. Lee's audacious invasion of Union territory was meant to shift the war's momentum, potentially bringing European recognition to the Confederacy and swaying Northern public opinion toward peace. Across the creek, Major General George Brinton McClellan commanded the Army of the Potomac, a force nearly twice the size of Lee's army. Known to his men as Lil Mac, McClellan was beloved by his troops but plagued by chronic hesitation that had already cost the Union precious opportunities. Yet on this crisp autumn morning, fortune had smiled upon him in an unprecedented way. Just days earlier, Union soldiers had discovered Lee's detailed battle plans wrapped around 3 cigars at an abandoned Confederate campsite, intelligence so valuable that McClellan reportedly declared, "Here is a paper with which if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." According to the Smithsonian Magazine's detailed analysis of Civil War intelligence failures, this discovery of Lee's lost order represented one of the most significant intelligence coups in military history. The strategic stakes could not have been higher. Lee's invasion of Maryland was designed to accomplish multiple objectives: relieve war-weary Virginia, potentially gain international recognition for the Confederacy, and influence the upcoming midterm elections that could force Lincoln toward a negotiated peace. The Confederate general had divided his army into 4 separate columns, a risky maneuver that violated the fundamental military principle of concentration of force. His plan called for the capture of Harper's Ferry while simultaneously threatening Washington and Baltimore, hoping to panic the Union government into hasty decisions. McClellan, despite possessing Lee's complete battle plans, moved with characteristic caution. The Union commander's natural tendency toward overestimation led him to believe he faced a Confederate force of 120,000 men, when in reality Lee commanded barely half that number. This psychological disadvantage would plague McClellan throughout the coming battle, causing him to squander opportunities that more aggressive commanders might have seized decisively. As dawn broke over Sharpsburg, the 2 armies found themselves positioned along opposite sides of Antietam Creek, a meandering waterway that would soon run red with American blood. Lee had chosen his defensive position carefully, placing his back to the Potomac River in a calculated gamble that would either result in glorious victory or catastrophic defeat. There would be no retreat if his lines broke. The stage was set for what would become the single bloodiest day in American military history, a day that would claim more than 23,000 casualties and forever alter the trajectory of the Civil War. The battle began at dawn's first light when Major General Joseph Hooker's 1st Corps launched their assault against the Confederate left flank, targeting the modest Dunker Church that would become synonymous with carnage. The whitewashed building, home to a pacifist German Baptist congregation, stood ironically at the center of the day's most violent fighting, its peaceful walls soon to be spattered with the blood of America's sons. Hooker, known for his aggressive tactics and nicknamed Fighting Joe, had positioned his corps north of Sharpsburg during the pre-dawn hours. His 30,000-man force included some of the Union's most experienced regiments, veterans who had learned the brutal lessons of war through previous campaigns. As the morning mist began to lift, revealing the Confederate positions ahead, Hooker's men moved forward through the now infamous cornfield, where tall stalks would soon conceal scenes of unimaginable horror. The initial Union advance caught Confederate Brigadier General Alexander Robert Lawton's division in a precarious position. Lawton's Georgians, though outnumbered, fought with the desperate ferocity of men defending their homeland's independence. The fighting in the cornfield quickly devolved into a nightmarish melee, where soldiers fired at muzzle flashes in the gathering smoke, often unable to distinguish friend from foe among the towering corn stalks. Private David Lewis Thompson of the 9th New York Infantry would later describe the scene. "The sound was like a scythe running through wheat, so many men falling at once. The metaphor proved grimly appropriate as bodies fell in rows, cut down by concentrated volleys that swept through the confined space like an invisible blade. Confederate reinforcements arrived in the form of Brigadier General John Bell Hood's Texan Brigade, men whose reputation for ferocity preceded them onto every battlefield. Hood's counterattack drove the Union forces back through the cornfield, but at tremendous cost. The Texas Brigade, which had entered the battle with over 1,000 men, would emerge with fewer than 400 capable of fighting. The struggle for Dunkirk intensified as both sides poured reinforcements into the maelstrom. Union Brigadier General Abner Doubleday's division joined the assault, their ranks including the famous Iron Brigade, Midwestern soldiers whose black hats and stern demeanor had earned them respect. Throughout the Army, these men from Wisconsin, Indiana, and Michigan fought with methodical precision, but even their discipline couldn't overcome the concentrated Confederate fire that swept their ranks dot as the morning progressed. The battle around Dunkirk became a ghastly back-and-forth affair. The church itself changed hands multiple times, with Union soldiers briefly occupying the building before being driven out by Confederate counterattacks. The small cemetery beside the church became a particularly contested point, where living soldiers fought among the headstones of the peacefully departed. The National Park Service's official battlefield study notes that the area around Dunkirk saw some of the heaviest concentrated fighting in Civil War history, with casualty rates approaching 60% in some regiments. The toll was staggering. Union Brigadier General Joseph King Fenno Mansfield, a career officer who had served his country for nearly 4 decades, fell mortally wounded while rallying his 12th Corps troops. His death sent shockwaves through the northern ranks. As soldiers watched their beloved commander carried from the field, his uniform soaked in blood. By mid-morning, the area around Dunkirk resembled a charnel house. The pristine white building stood pockmarked with bullet holes, its windows shattered, its peaceful sanctuary violated by the instruments of war. Yet neither side could claim decisive victory in this sector, as both armies had bled themselves nearly white in their attempts to control this modest piece of Maryland countryside. As the morning's carnage around Dunkirk reached its crescendo, the focus of battle shifted to a seemingly innocuous farm road that meandered through the Confederate center. This modest thoroughfare, worn deep by years of wagon traffic and known locally as the Sunken Road, would soon earn a more sinister name that would echo through American memory: Bloody Lane. Major General Daniel Harvey Hill's Confederate division had taken position along this natural fortification, using the road's worn depression as a ready-made trench. Hill, a former mathematics professor turned warrior, had positioned his North Carolinians and Alabamians with the precision of a scholar, creating interlocking fields of fire that would prove devastatingly effective against Union assault columns. The Union attack came from Major General William Henry French's 2nd Corps division, approximately 5,000 men advancing across open farmland toward Hill's concealed positions. French, a Mexican War veteran whose methodical approach had earned him the nickname Old Blinky, led his men forward in traditional formation-dense columns that made impressive displays, but often concentrated targets for enemy marksmen. The first Union assault waves advanced with parade ground precision, their regimental colors snapping in the autumn breeze as drummers beat the cadence of attack. But as they crested the rise overlooking the sunken road, Hill's Confederates rose from concealment like specters emerging from the earth itself. The devastating volley that followed cut down entire companies in seconds, leaving the field carpeted with blue uniformed bodies. Brigadier General Max Weber's brigade bore the brunt of this initial slaughter. Weber, a German immigrant who had risen through the ranks on merit and courage, watched helplessly as his regiments disintegrated under the concentrated Confederate fire. The 14th Connecticut Infantry suffered particularly grievous losses, with nearly half their number falling in the first 10 minutes of fighting. According to Harper's weekly contemporary battlefield reporting, the sight of Union casualties in the Bloody Lane was so horrific that even veteran war correspondents struggled to find adequate descriptions. Yet French's men regrouped and launched successive attacks against the Confederate position. The 2nd Maryland Infantry, fighting on home soil, pressed forward with particular determination. Their advance brought them within 50 yards of the sunken road, before Hill's defenders drove them back with bayonet charges that left both sides bloodied and exhausted. The tide began to turn when Confederate Brigadier General Robert Emmett Rhodes made a fatal tactical error. Believing his Alabama regiment was being outflanked, Rhodes ordered a withdrawal that created a gap in the Confederate line. This gap was quickly exploited by elements of Major General Israel Bush Richardson's division. Veteran soldiers who poured through the breach like water through a broken dam. Richardson, known as Fighting Dick to his men, was a soldier's soldier who led from the front. His Irish Brigade, commanded by Brigadier General Thomas Francis Marr, advanced with their distinctive green flags flying, their ranks filled with immigrants fighting to prove their loyalty to their adopted homeland. These Irishmen, many of whom had fled the potato famine's devastation, now faced a different kind of death in Maryland's fields. The breakthrough at Bloody Lane created panic in the Confederate ranks. Hill's division, which had held its position magnificently for hours, suddenly found Union troops flanking their defensive line. The orderly withdrawal became a rout as Confederate soldiers abandoned the sunken road, leaving behind weapons, equipment, and their dead comrades. Union forces quickly occupied the abandoned Confederate position, and the sight that greeted them was one that would haunt survivors for the remainder of their lives. The sunken road was literally filled with Confederate corpses, stacked 3 and 4 deep in places. Bodies lay so thick that, according to one Union soldier's account, a man could walk the length of the road without touching the ground, stepping only on the remains of Southern boys who would never see home again. The capture of Bloody Lane represented a critical breakthrough in the Union assault, creating a massive gap in Lee's center that begged for exploitation. Yet McClellan, still believing he faced overwhelming numbers, failed to capitalize on this opportunity, allowing Lee precious time to shift reserves and plug the breach. While the morning's fighting raged around Dunker Church and Bloody Lane, the Union's left flank faced its own deadly challenge. At what would become known as Burnside's Bridge, this narrow stone arch spanning Antietam Creek represented the sole crossing point for Major General Ambrose Everett Burnside's 9th Corps, creating a tactical bottleneck that Confederate defenders would exploit with lethal efficiency. Burnside, whose distinctive facial hair would eventually lend its name to the term sideburns, commanded nearly 14,000 men positioned east of the creek. His orders from McClellan were clear: cross Antietam Creek and strike the Confederate right flank, potentially rolling up Lee's entire defensive line. Yet the execution of these seemingly simple orders would prove far more complex than either general anticipated. The bridge itself was a modest structure, barely wide enough for a wagon and flanked by steep banks that channeled any assault into a deadly funnel. Confederate Brigadier General Robert Augustus Toombs had positioned his Georgia sharpshooters among the limestone bluffs overlooking the crossing, creating an impregnable position that commanded every approach to the bridge. Toombs, a former United States Senator who had abandoned politics for warfare, understood the tactical situation perfectly. His small force of Georgians, numbering fewer than 400 men, occupied positions that negated Burnside's overwhelming numerical advantage from their elevated perches. Confederate marksmen could pick off Union soldiers attempting to cross the narrow span with methodical precision. The first Union assault began at 10 o'clock in the morning when the 11th Connecticut Infantry attempted to storm across the bridge in column formation. The result was predictable and horrific. Confederate volleys swept the narrow span clean, leaving it carpeted with blue uniform casualties. Colonel Henry Walter Kingsbury, the regiment's beloved commander, fell mortally wounded in this initial attempt, his death demoralizing troops who had never before failed in their duty. Contemporary accounts from the Richmond Enquirer described the defensive action at the bridge as one of the most tactically brilliant small unit actions of the entire war. Burnside's subsequent attempts proved equally futile. The 2nd Maryland and 6th New Hampshire Infantry Regiments launched successive assaults, each meeting the same devastating fate as their predecessors. The narrow bridge became a gauntlet of death where courage meant nothing and tactical position meant everything. The psychological toll on Union soldiers proved as devastating as the physical casualties. Men who had fought bravely in previous battles found themselves paralyzed by the prospect of charging across that stone bridge, knowing that Confederate rifles waited to cut them down before they could even reach the opposite bank. Officers struggled to maintain discipline as soldiers began to question orders that seemed tantamount to suicide. Colonel George Crook of the 36th Ohio Infantry proposed an alternative solution: fording the creek at a downstream location where the water ran shallow enough to wade across. This tactical innovation might have succeeded, but Burnside remained fixated on the bridge, perhaps believing that McClellan's orders required him to use that specific crossing point. The breakthrough finally came when Colonel Edward Ferrero's brigade, composed of the 51st New York and 51st Pennsylvania Infantry Regiments, volunteered for one final assault. These men, many of them immigrants and working-class soldiers, had been promised a whiskey ration if they succeeded in taking the bridge, a motivation that proved more effective than appeals to patriotism or duty. Ferrero's assault succeeded. Through sheer audacity and sacrifice, the two regiments charged across the bridge in a desperate rush, accepting horrific casualties in exchange for momentum. Union soldiers fell by the dozens, but enough survived to establish a foothold on the western bank, finally breaking Confederate control of the crossing. Once across Antietam Creek, Burnside's corps faced the daunting task of reforming under fire and preparing for the advance on Sharpsburg. The delay caused by the bridge fighting had consumed precious hours' time that Lee used to reposition his battered forces and prepare for the final phase of the battle. The successful crossing of Burnside's bridge represented a tactical victory, purchased with enormous bloodshed. It had also highlighted one of the Union Army's greatest weaknesses: the failure to coordinate simultaneous attacks that might have overwhelmed Confederate defenses. Instead of 3 coordinated assaults, Lee faced 3 separate battles that he could address sequentially, using his limited reserves to maximum effect. By mid-afternoon, General Robert Edward Lee faced the gravest crisis of his military career. His Army of Northern Virginia had been battered from 3 directions, casualties mounted by the thousands, and Burnside's 9th Corps was finally across Antietam Creek, poised to roll up his vulnerable right flank. With his back to the Potomac River and no avenue of retreat, Lee confronted the very real possibility that his invasion of Maryland would end in the complete destruction of Confederate hopes for independence. The situation along the Confederate right had become desperate. Brigadier General David Rump Jones's division, already weakened by morning casualties, watched helplessly as 14,000 Union soldiers formed battle lines. On the western bank of Antietam Creek, Jones, a career soldier whose steady demeanor had earned him the nickname Neighbor, knew his scattered regiments could not withstand a coordinated Union assault. Lee's response to this crisis demonstrated the calculated audacity that had made him legendary. Rather than ordering a general retreat that might have saved his army, but abandoned his strategic objectives, the Confederate commander chose to reinforce his threatened right flank with virtually every available reserve. This decision stripped other sectors of their defenders, creating vulnerabilities that a more aggressive Union commander might have exploited decisively. The transfer of Confederate reserves began with the remnants of Major General Daniel Harvey, Hill's division, survivors of the morning's carnage at Bloody Lane. These battle-scarred veterans, many wounded and all exhausted, trudged southward through Sharpsburg's dusty streets while Union artillery shells burst overhead. Their movement did not go unnoticed by Federal observers, who reported Confederate troop concentrations building near the town's outskirts. Confederate artillery, commanded by the brilliant Colonel Stephen Dill Lee, played a crucial role in buying time for these defensive preparations. Lee's batteries, positioned on the high ground west of Sharpsburg, maintained a devastating fire that slowed Burnside's advance and inflicted significant casualties on Union formations attempting to deploy for attack. Yet even as Lee concentrated his available forces, he knew that time was his greatest enemy. Union numerical superiority would eventually overwhelm his depleted regiments. Unless reinforcements arrived soon, his desperate gaze turned southward, toward the road from Harper's Ferry, where Major General Ambrose Powell Hill's Light Division was conducting a forced march that would determine the battle's outcome. Military historians, according to the Journal of Military History, consider A.P. Hill's march from Harper's Ferry to Antietam one of the most remarkable forced marches in American military history. Hill, known for his red battle shirt and aggressive tactics, had received Lee's urgent summons at dawn. His division, having participated in the successful capture of Harper's Ferry, was 17 miles away when the battle began. Hill's response was immediate and characteristically bold. He ordered his men to begin a forced march that would test the limits of human endurance. The Light Division's march became an epic of determination and sacrifice. Hill's soldiers, already exhausted from days of continuous campaigning, pushed themselves beyond normal physical limitations. The Virginia general himself set the pace, his distinctive red shirt visible at the column's head as he urged his men forward. Stragglers fell by the wayside, overcome by heat and exhaustion, but the core of the division maintained its punishing pace. As Hill's men covered the miles between Harper's Ferry and Sharpsburg, the sound of artillery fire grew steadily louder, indicating the battle's mounting intensity. Confederate couriers met the marching column with increasingly urgent messages from Lee, each dispatch emphasizing the Army's desperate situation and the critical need for immediate reinforcement. The psychological impact of Hill's approach began to affect both armies, even before his troops appeared on the battlefield. Confederate defenders, hearing rumors of reinforcements approaching from the south, found renewed determination to hold their positions. Conversely, Union commanders received conflicting intelligence reports about Confederate troop movements, creating uncertainty that would prove costly in the battle's final hours. Meanwhile, Burnside's long-delayed assault finally began to develop momentum. Union regiments, having spent hours reorganizing after their costly river crossing, advanced toward Sharpsburg in formation that promised to overwhelm the weakened Confederate right. The sight of this massive force moving across the Maryland landscape sent chills through Confederate observers, who realized that their army's survival might depend on the arrival of Hill's distant division. Lee's gamble was entering its most critical phase, with the fate of the Confederacy hanging in the balance. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the scarred Maryland landscape. As Burnside's massive assault finally gained momentum, 14,000 Union soldiers advanced across the fields, west of Antietam Creek, in a display of martial power that seemed to promise the Confederate Army's destruction. Their battle lines stretched for nearly a mile, regimental colors snapping in the autumn breeze as drummers beat the cadence of what many believed would be the war's decisive attack. Confederate defenders watched this awesome spectacle with growing desperation. Brigadier General David Rumph Jones's division, already reduced to fewer than 3,000 effective soldiers, prepared to make their final stand among Sharpsburg's outskirts. These veterans knew that mathematical certainty favored their enemies, yet Southern pride demanded they sell their lives dearly rather than yield Maryland soil. Without a fight, the Union advance initially proceeded according to plan. Brigadier General Orlando Bolivar Wilcox's division struck the Confederate right flank with overwhelming force, driving Jones's scattered regiments back through the town's southern approaches. Houses became fortresses as Confederate soldiers fought from windows and doorways, their rifle fire slowing but not stopping the Union juggernaut. Colonel Hugh Ewing's brigade penetrated deepest into Confederate territory, their advance threatening to cut Lee's army off from its only escape route across the Potomac River. Ewing, nephew of the famous General William Tecumseh Sherman, led his Ohioans with characteristic aggressiveness. Sensing that total victory lay within their grasp, his men could see the Shepherdstown Road, the vital artery that connected Lee's army to Virginia and safety. Yet even as Union success seemed assured, the first signs of hesitation began to appear in Burnside's assault. The Ninth Corps' commander, perhaps influenced by McClellan's characteristic caution, began to worry about Confederate reserves that intelligence reports suggested were massing for counterattack. This psychological uncertainty would prove fatal to Union hopes of decisive victory. The moment that changed everything came at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when Confederate lookouts spotted a column of dust rising from the Harper's Ferry Road. Major General Ambrose Powell Hill's Light Division had completed their 17-mile forced march in record time, arriving at the precise moment when their intervention could alter the battle's outcome. Hill himself led the advance elements, his red battle shirt clearly visible as he galloped ahead of his exhausted but determined soldiers. The sight of their general's distinctive uniform set word racing through Confederate ranks. Reinforcements had arrived at last. The psychological impact was immediate and profound, as Southern soldiers who had prepared for death or capture suddenly found new hope for survival. The official records of the War of the Rebellion document Hill's arrival time at precisely 4:15 in the afternoon, noting that his division had covered 17 miles in less than 8 hours. Hill's deployment was masterful in its simplicity and timing, rather than allowing his men time to rest and reform. The Virginia general immediately committed his leading brigade under Brigadier General Maxcy Gregg to strike the exposed left flank of Burnside's advance. Gregg's South Carolinians, though exhausted from their punishing march, retained enough fighting spirit to launch a devastating counterattack against unsuspecting Union forces. The impact of Hill's intervention was magnified by Burnside's failure to maintain adequate reconnaissance. Union commanders, focused on their advance toward Sharpsburg, had neglected to secure their southern flank adequately. When Gregg's Confederates struck, they achieved complete tactical surprise, rolling up entire Union regiments before effective resistance could be organized. Brigadier General Isaac Peace Rodman's division bore the brunt of Hill's counterattack. Rodman, a Rhode Island businessman turned soldier, was mortally wounded while attempting to rally his men against the unexpected Confederate assault. His death sent shockwaves through Union ranks as soldiers watched their popular commander fall. At the moment when victory had seemed assured, the psychological reversal was devastating. Union soldiers who had advanced confidently across Maryland fields suddenly found themselves retreating in disorder, pursued by Confederate troops whose very presence seemed impossible. The careful formations that had promised overwhelming victory dissolved into chaos as regiments struggled to maintain cohesion under Hill's relentless pressure. Hill's counterattack not only stopped Burnside's assault, but threatened to drive the Union Ninth Corps back across Antietam Creek entirely. Only the intervention of artillery and the natural defensive barrier of the creek itself prevented what might have become a complete rout. As darkness fell over the battlefield, both armies settled into defensive positions, each having suffered grievous losses without achieving decisive victory. The arrival of A.P. Hill's Light Division had saved Lee's army from destruction, but at enormous cost to both sides. The bloodiest day in American history was finally ending. As darkness settled over the Antietam battlefield on the evening of September 17, 1862, an eerie silence replaced the thunder of artillery and crack of musketry that had defined the bloodiest day in American military history. The Maryland landscape, which had awakened that morning to pastoral tranquility, now resembled a vision of hell, carpeted with the bodies of more than 23,000 American soldiers who had fallen in a single day's fighting. General Robert Edward Lee faced the most critical decision of his military career. As he surveyed the carnage around Sharpsburg, his Army of Northern Virginia had survived the day, but barely. Casualty reports filtered in from his division commanders painted a grim picture. Nearly 13,000 Confederate soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured, representing almost a quarter of his entire force. Many regiments existed only in name, their ranks so decimated that they could no longer function as effective fighting units. The Confederate position, precarious before the battle, had become virtually untenable. Lee's army stood with its back to the Potomac River, surrounded on three sides by Union forces that still maintained overwhelming numerical superiority. Logic dictated immediate retreat across the river into Virginia, abandoning the strategic objectives that had brought the Army of Northern Virginia into Maryland. In the first place, yet Lee's character was defined by audacity in the face of impossible odds. Throughout the night of September 17th, the Confederate commander wrestled with a decision that would determine not only his army's fate, but potentially the entire course of American history. His staff officers, exhausted by the day's carnage, urged retreat while conditions still permitted an orderly withdrawal. But Lee remained on the battlefield, studying Union positions and calculating whether his battered forces could somehow continue the campaign. Major General George Brenton McClellan faced an equally momentous decision from the opposite perspective. His Army of the Potomac had fought magnificently, inflicting severe casualties on Lee's forces while maintaining tactical cohesion. Despite horrific losses, Union commanders reported that Confederate lines appeared thin and vulnerable, suggesting that a coordinated assault on September 18th might achieve the decisive victory that had eluded them the previous day. According to the New York Tribune's battlefield correspondent, McClellan possessed sufficient reserves to resume the offensive on September 18th, with at least 20,000 fresh troops available for immediate deployment. Yet McClellan's chronic hesitation once again proved decisive. The Union commander, still believing he faced a Confederate force larger than his own, chose caution over aggression. Instead of ordering a general assault that might have destroyed Lee's army entirely, McClellan decided to await reinforcements and allow his troops time to recover from their ordeal. This fateful decision would haunt McClellan for the remainder of his military career. Lee, recognizing that his strategic position was hopeless, used the respite to begin withdrawing his army across the Potomac River. During the night of September 18th, by dawn of September 19th, the Army of Northern Virginia had vanished from Maryland soil, leaving behind only their dead and the detritus of a campaign that had promised so much, but delivered only suffering. The strategic consequences of Antietam extended far beyond the immediate military results. Lee's invasion of Maryland had been designed to shift the war's momentum, potentially securing European recognition for the Confederacy and influencing Northern public opinion toward a negotiated peace. The battle's outcome effectively ended these hopes, ensuring that the Civil War would continue until one side achieved complete victory. Perhaps most importantly, Antietam provided President Abraham Lincoln with the political capital necessary to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862. This executive action transformed the conflict from a war for union into a moral crusade against slavery, making European intervention on behalf of the Confederacy virtually impossible. The human cost of Antietam staggered both sides. Union casualties totaled approximately 12,300, while Confederate losses reached nearly 11,000. These numbers, horrific in their magnitude, represented more American casualties than had been suffered in all previous American wars combined. Families across the nation would mourn sons, fathers, and brothers who had fallen in Maryland's fields, their sacrifice becoming part of the national memory that would define American identity. For generations, the Battle of Antietam marked a crucial turning point in the American Civil War, demonstrating that neither side possessed the strength to achieve quick victory through a single decisive engagement. The conflict would continue for 2.5 more years, consuming hundreds of thousands of additional lives, before reaching its conclusion at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865. The modest town of Sharpsburg returned to peaceful obscurity, but the events of September 17, 1862, had forever altered the trajectory of American history. The Union had been preserved, slavery's expansion halted, and the foundation laid for a reunited nation that would emerge from Civil War as a modern industrial power. The price paid in blood at Antietam had purchased nothing less than the survival of American democracy itself.